and welcome back to Book and Page. We are on our way to Shakespeare once more, and since I have already done a video discussing, in brief, Shakespeare's life, link to that video down below, I think we ought to talk about Shakespeare after death. And by the way, you can see the title of this video, you know what I mean. How do we still have Shakespeare? This might seem like a very odd question to ask, especially for those of you who have grown up with Shakespeare just being a constant in English classes. Hey, yeah, he's a great writer. He did a lot of plays. Most of them were super boring. Why do I have to read this? Well, it's actually kind of surprising that we still have Shakespeare's plays. Altogether, it took quite a lot for us to get here, and we do actually have a couple of people we need to thank. First and foremost, I actually need to thank somebody a little different, which would be Andrea Mays. Her book, The Millionaire and the Bard, which actually discusses the millionaire Henry Folger's obsession with the first folio, is a great source of information on the creation of sort of the first printing of Shakespeare. Not only does she walk you through who does what, but it's how it's done, and all of those things, which I'm going to be touching on, but Andrea Mays does it in such better detail, and the story overall of Henry Folger is a fascinating one, especially if you've ever been to Henry Folger's Shakespeare Library in Washington. So, thanks Andrea May. So, how did we actually keep Shakespeare? Before we could discuss how we actually kept Shakespeare, it is worth laying out for people who haven't perhaps done the reading that I have done, because I'm a weirdo who likes reading on strange subjects. What was the problem that would have resulted in us losing Shakespeare? And that is actually twofold. Threefold, really. First and foremost, most artists are not recognized within their lifetime. There are very few artists who are recognized as big, important figures while they're still alive and creating art. Oftentimes, it takes the death of the artist, and then the attachment to the art by some big, important figures. The rich and powerful, often for the fine art community, and so on. To raise this person who was a person, this person in this singular context, making art often for this singular context, and raising them out of obscurity, and continuing on. Now, some artists are more recognized within their time. People like Donatello, Raphael, Michelangelo, all the Ninja Turtles were recognized by patron families in Italy, often by the Pope himself, and we have a lot of their art still because of that patronage. Shakespeare also did have some royal patronage, most notably between Elizabeth I and James I. However, that is not to say that playwriting was exactly the big important thing. We have to keep in mind that in this time, plays are sort of this questionable in-between art form that goes through periods of derision and, hey, they performed for the king and or queen. And to really imagine this, it helps to picture a map of London in this time, or get a map of London in which you find all of the theaters are squished out on the outer edges of the city. They're up with the bear baiting and the dog fights. But a lot of people are still coming to see them. We do have royal shows happening, but we've also got communities that are actively actually trying to kick these playgoers out. And that's a whole other section of Shakespeare's life, is trying to start a theater in a well-to-do community and basically having the community rise up against him and kick him out. So ultimately we have artists who not always recognized within their lifetime. And the fact that, like, traditionally with plays, you're not seeing high art. You're not seeing printed versions. It's a performance that you go and see if it's in fashion, if it's a play that sounds interesting. If it's not plague time, theaters get closed during plague because don't put that many people that close together. So there's a lot of caveats attached to play going, and it simply results in not having plays printed. The two additional problems from here are that Shakespeare doesn't own the rights to most of his plays. Oh, yeah. A bunch of people are just like, ugh, what do you mean? Ugh, what do you mean? Well, if Shakespeare was part of a company at a time, and ultimately I believe there were at least two companies he was involved in, with the King's Men and the Lord Chamberlain's Men. If Shakespeare was involved in these companies and wrote the plays based on these companies, which he often did, he often wrote parts around certain actors. They were actually kind of famous actors that he would write parts for. The company then retained the rights of ownership of these plays. And this was especially true if they had the patronage of a big person, right? Like the Lord Chamberlain's Men had the patronage of the Lord Chamberlain. So he was sort of the big clot behind it who could bop anybody down from trying to perform these plays, even if, say, Shakespeare was headhunted. That is to say, if another playing company saw the talent in him and paid him a lot of money to leave his company and go to theirs, he would actively have to leave any performances he wrote as part of that original company behind. He does not own those plays. Now, if he wrote them independently and they became part of sort of just the off-season stuff while he's writing new ones for the company, that's a little more in that gray area, but the companies themselves hold ownership over the plays far more than the artist does. Shakespeare was lucky he actually held shares in the companies that he performed in, and that's ultimately how we get the Globe Theatre. But after his death, Shakespeare, for the most part, doesn't own the plays. It's not something that his family's taking over and being responsible for. These are plays that his companies can still perform. So, there's that. There's that. So we can't print, because oftentimes we just don't. It's not in fashion. Playgoing is kind of, it's not high art. The companies own the plays, so can't print them that way, especially if you've written for multiple companies, which Shakespeare did. You can't print those. And then the other major concern is people stealing these. Oh yeah, okay. So the weird thing about Shakespeare is we tend to envision him as sort of this artist who just thought up these great, amazing things, especially if you're a lover of Shakespeare. But the more you study Shakespeare, the more you realize that he is pulling from other texts. His histories, certainly, but his romances, his comedies, his tragedies, they've got previous mythological connections, historical connections, pseudo-historical narrative connections. Like, these characters have previous versions. Even things like Romeo and Juliet, ultimately made famous by Shakespeare, but he's not thinking these out of the void. He's had something that he's previously read. He had access to a lot of libraries, so Shakespeare, people who don't think Shakespeare is Shakespeare, get out. He's got access to things. He puts his own creative spin on it, and ultimately they become the things that we're connected to. But this does mean that you have to be careful, because the company could claim that they've got ownership of something, but if another play that's kind of like one, but kind of different shows up, then same source material. Now, how companies generally avoided this is you're not actually finding full scripts of plays. If you're in a performance now, you're often handed a full script, and you sit there and you highlight all of your sections, but you've got the full thing there. You know the entire story from the first read through. That is not how plays are performed in Elizabethan Jacobean times, because you can't risk somebody coming along, picking up one of these scripts, and stealing your play. So the writer often is going to have a full script because he has written it, but what then happens is somebody goes through the script and actually writes out all of a character's lines. Just boom, 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 boom. And that is what the actor is handed. Yeah. You then sit down with the writer who has the full version, or somebody who's going to be feeding you lines. They might also have a full version. And you practice to the point where you actually know what is going before and after these lines so that you can do the whole play. But this is done, again, so no one can pick up a full version of the play and walk off with it. They're only ever, at most, going to get one character's lines completely out of context. Unless you somehow get the original writer's version. And even then, it gets squirrelier from there. Because the thing is, as practices are occurring, the writer is still part of this. It's not like today where you lease the rights of a play to perform it, and you get the full, complete play, beginning to end, and the writer is not involved, and it's just the actors and the director and the stage people. With Shakespeare, he is part of this company. He might even be playing parts in his own play. He is developing it as they continue practicing. Because like I said, a lot of these parts are written for certain performers. So a performer might start ad-libbing something, and Shakespeare will be like, oh, that was good. So we're going to put this in, we're going to change this, and in response to that statement, we're going to have this person say this. So even Shakespeare's copy probably looked real messed up by the end of the first run of this performance. So finding a full copy of the end performance is extremely difficult, and it gets worse. Because you could have a really messed up Shakespearean copy, which is your best bet for then printing Shakespeare as Shakespeare wrote it, but you could try and get your hands on as many of the individual scripts as you can, and then fill in what you can remember. You could have an actor who's good at memorization who then fills in what he remembers, because I learn from hearing things. So when I've done performances in scenes that I'm in, by the end of the play, I often know everybody else's lines too, because I've heard it so often. But what happens if your character isn't included in a scene? Can you remember enough of that to create some sort of semblance of what was originally there? And this gets even squirrelier than if you are trying to steal a play, because what you might do is send an actor who's really good at memorization to see a play in performance. They come out and then desperately write as much down as they can remember, and you can steal a play that way. So printing copies of Shakespeare becomes really hard because the way it's performed doesn't give you full, clean copies. There are a variety of partial copies, and maybe if you're super lucky, you get Shakespeare's original copy. I hate to say it, but we have no guarantees. let's talk about ultimately how we do have something that might have been Shakespeare's work. And that is two of his friends and company players, John Hemmingins, and Henry Condell. And these two folks are, at least they seem to have been relatively close to Shakespeare. They served in both the King's Men and the Lord Chamberlain's Men along with him. They played performances, again, likely having parts written for them. They show up in playbills alongside Shakespeare, and most importantly, they show up in Shakespeare's will. In Shakespeare's will, it's mostly physical things, right? Again, because the companies own a lot of the plays, he's not thinking about his writing here. He's thinking about physical things. He gives his daughter silverware and a silver bowl, but he gives several of his good friends in these companies memorial rings to remember him by. So we get the sense that these were men who were close to each other. And then we start losing more and more of Shakespeare's generations. We start losing the other men with the rings. We start losing these great actors that he wrote parts for. And as John and Henry realize that they are slowly becoming the last of this generation who knew and worked with Shakespeare, they take a look at what's happened to his work. And probably a lot of things went through their minds, a lot of which was probably disheartening for the fact that they were watching their friend's memory die as all their mutual friends also died. So in 1620, they make the decision that they are going to go ahead with the printing of all of Shakespeare's dramatic works. And this is an absolutely massive project. Absolutely massive. And what really speaks to me is the fact that they had to have recognized it was not going to make them any money. These were men who saw something important in their friend's work and said, we have to save it. People have to remember Shakespeare. They have to remember he was here and he wrote these things. It wasn't to get them money or fame. It really was to memorialize Shakespeare in the literary world. And we get another relatively heavy hitter behind this, that is Ben Jonson, the poet, who provides a couple of items for the lead-in for memorializing Shakespeare. And in doing this, they set about on this massive project that sets out the Shakespearean canon as we know it. Which is to say, they go through and secure as many of Shakespeare's remaining plays as they can. But if you study Shakespeare, you know that there's supposedly plenty of others that have disappeared. Well, the problem is, if they weren't super popular, there's a strong chance that none of the scripts from these survived. So it's possible that Hemmingins and Condell simply couldn't get their hands on anything to ultimately reprint. What they did get their hands on, we have no idea. We have no idea what version of these plays we're seeing. Are we seeing Shakespeare's original written ones, which they've somehow preserved, or are we seeing rough copies? We know it's at least a mix, because we have other copies of Shakespeare that have ultimately survived, that are a lot closer to what's considered genuine and reprinted today. And that's why I always point out that Oxford Shakespeares are very good, because they're going to tell you in the footnotes where certain sections are coming from. They're going to name a number, and then it's either going to be folio or quarto. And a folio is a bigger version. The paper here is only folded twice. A quarto, the page is folded 4 times. So it's a smaller version with more pages. Technical terms, it's not super important, but it is a question of the validity of these things, where they're coming from. And if you ever heard the first folio spoken about, That's what Hemmings and Condell are actually working at. The first official printing of all of Shakespeare's works, which doesn't include at least one of them that we still have. Yeah, you see, even the first folio as the official printing of all of Shakespeare's works is not quite correct for a number of reasons. Unfortunately, Pericles was never had its rights secured for the first folio printing. So it is the one surviving Shakespearean play that we know was Shakespeare that doesn't show up in the first folio. There's a second play that was almost like this, which was Troilus and Cressida, another lesser-known Shakespearean play, which originally wasn't going to be printed because they hadn't secured the rights, and then partway through the printing they did, and it was added in. Yay! So Pericles survived through other printings and other versions. There were other printings. Some of them weren't legally allowed by the Lord Chamberlain's men, such as the false folio, which was printed before the first folio, and it wasn't even a folio, it was a quarto, and included things that weren't Shakespeare, and ultimately it becomes a mess. So always pay attention to those footnotes telling you where exactly this information is coming from. The first folio, though, was a big push to save Shakespeare, and even then, we might have screwed him up in the printing. You see, the printing system here is a little questionable. First and foremost, you start printing in the middle. Yes, in the middle. You basically start from the middle out. Additionally, you print one page, and you print the entire copy of this page for the entire print run. The first folio print run, about 750 copies. So you get 750 copies of this page, and you do that because you need all that typeset for the next page. You correct as you go. You make adjustments, you scratch things out, but you don't get rid of the old pages. That would waste paper. So sometimes pages just show up that are incorrect. For example, before they secured Troilus and Cressida, they accidentally printed out the first page for most of them. Well, rather than get rid of that, they just crossed it out and put it in the book. It's a very messy thing. Since they're starting in the middle, the printer actually has to guess the amount of text they can fit on a page, and how it's going to continue on to the next page. And this guessing doesn't always work out. They might actually have additional space, so a word might be repeated from the end of one page and the beginning of the next one. Or they could actually run out of space, and then ultimately the printer will choose to change the text to make it fit. Yeah, they might take out line breaks or even shorten the line altogether because it's a little bit of guesswork. With printing like this, you actually have to be very flexible. It's a little awkward. It's a little awkward. It's very awkward. So altogether, what we get is a printing of Shakespeare's works in folio format, which was amazing to begin with. See, the folio format made sense for Shakespeare because it made an absolutely massive 900-page book, but it could be all printed in one text. If they had gone for the smaller quarto, they would have had to break it up. But they picked the folio. Problem with picking the folio is the folio is used for high art, not for plays. So ultimately, there are some people who deride Shakespeare first getting printed in this folio format because plays, those aren't important. But thankfully, John Hemmings, Henry Condell, and ultimately the printing house of William Jaggard at the sign of the Half Eagle and Key saw something different. They saw printing Shakespeare as worth it. And thanks to them, we have a lot of Shakespeare that we ultimately would have lost. How much of it's the original Shakespeare, we're never going to know that. until somehow we find a copy of Shakespeare's manuscripts, which the likelihood of that is very slim. We're just going to have to thank the world that a couple people saw the worth of Shakespeare. And a couple people saw the worth of the first folio enough to keep it. Again, if you're interested, reading The Millionaire and the Bard, you'll learn that some of these folios were actually cannibalized in order to make others look prettier. It's not always about the book. Sometimes it's about how much the book is worth. Thankfully, though, we have enough of Shakespeare in different versions that we can continue reading him today, even if he might bore you to death in English class. Or bore you to death on a YouTube video. At least with me, you can turn me off. So, I'm gonna get reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.